Buonasera a tutti, io sono Alberto Mingardi, questo è un webinar dell'Istituto Bruno Leoni. Come vedete alle mie spalle ho una citazione, la citazione di un cartone animato di un qualche successo, perlomeno per 2 generazioni, forse 3 generazioni di persone. Questa citazione è stata scelta perché stasera parliamo di un libro che IBL Libri, cioè la casa editrice del nostro istituto, ha appena pubblicato, un libro che può essere acquistato tranquillamente e sul sito web dell'IBL e su Amazon e sulle maggiori piattaforme, che si intitola 101 grandi pensatori liberali, una tradizione in difesa della libertà. 101 sembrano tantissimi pensatori, sembrano tante figure storiche. In realtà l'autore di questo libro, Eamonn Butler, ci spiegherà come è pervenuto a quella che comunque è una selezione, perché ha scelto di inserire alcuni nomi e invece di non inserirne altri. L'idea di questo volume è quella di offrire dei brevi percorsi biografici e nel pensiero di queste figure per andare a comporre poi un mosaico d'insieme che è quello che definisce una school of thought, così recita il volume, ovvero una scuola, una tradizione di pensiero, qual è quella del liberalismo classico. Eamonn Butler è un amico, è un importante protagonista del dibattito pubblico inglese, un importante protagonista del liberalismo classico contemporaneo. Ha studiato a St. Andrews in Scozia, è il direttore dell'Adam Smith Institute di Londra, un think tank che ha fondato assieme a Madsen Piri 2 o 3 anni fa. No, in realtà è un think tank attivo da tempo, molto importante nella discussione politica britannica, ma da alcuni anni si è anche dedicato a fare un mestiere veramente importante, del quale il nostro istituto ha beneficiato, così come altre realtà che hanno tradotto i lavori di Eamonn in giro per il mondo, cioè si è messo a scrivere libri divulgativi pensati per un pubblico di non specialisti, che potessero portare il messaggio del liberalismo classico, potessero diffondere il pensiero di autori importanti nella storia del pensiero economico, nella storia del pensiero politico, anche a persone che non necessariamente hanno fatto studi di questo tipo, che non necessariamente hanno familiarità con i rudimenti dell'economia o della scienza politica, ma hanno un interesse per questa tradizione di pensiero e un interesse culturale per cui gli pare rilevante sapere che cosa ha detto, per esempio, Adam Smith tra i suoi libri che l'Istituto Bruno Leoni ha tradotto e pubblicato in italiano. Uno che a me è particolarmente caro e che consiglio sempre è La ricchezza delle nazioni in pillole. La ricchezza delle nazioni è un libro importantissimo, il libro dal quale si avvia la storia dell'economia politica come scienza, è il secondo grande lavoro di Adam Smith, ma indubbiamente, se non altro per le dimensioni, non è un libro, come dire, a portata di tutti. Il assai più veloce libricino di Eamonn Butler invece riesce a portare le persone a leggere Smith, quindi a familiarizzare con le parole di Smith, ma nello stesso tempo dà loro una visione d'insieme che sarebbe probabilmente, diciamo così, improponibile per la maggioranza dei lettori ottenere invece compulsando l'intera ricchezza delle nazioni. Quindi noi come istituto e come IBL Libri abbiamo veramente tratto beneficio da questa attività, da questa missione divulgativa di Eamonn, che è uno di quegli studiosi che sanno bene che farsi capire dalle persone è una virtù e non invece un terribile vizio, e siamo molto contenti oggi di presentare assieme con lui questa sua nuova fatica editoriale, 101 per l'appunto, pensatori liberali. Lasciatemi ora passare all'inglese. Now I'll switch to English. Eamonn, you can believe I just said very nice things about you.
Sure you did, yes.
Giving a very quick summary. And I was saying that we are really grateful at Istituto Bruno Leoni to you for your splendid work in writing and in making easily digestible for people very important concepts within the boundaries of the classical liberal tradition, from Adam Smith to Friedrich Hayek to Ludwig von Mises, and now to this work, which is entitled 110 Classical Liberals. So, of course, I think the first question, and then it's up to you clearly, is who are these 110? Why did you put them together? What is really that make all of them the same lot in your perspective?
Well, I think there are, I mean, the number 101 just grew out of the fact that I was doing this, and it seemed to roughly come to about 100, and I ended up with 101. That seemed like a good number. But the principles, I think, which unify them is, firstly, they have to be thinkers. They have to be creative thinkers. So people like politicians don't count unless they're also noted philosophers or economists or something like that. So they've got to be thinkers, and they must be liberals, not conservatives, but they have to be liberals. They have to believe in human freedom and toleration, and to believe in the spontaneous order of society rather than a planned society, and all of the other things, and the rule of law, and all of the other things which classical liberals or neoliberals believe in. So there again, I mean, that excludes a number of people like, well, in the English language, Edmund Burke, who was a politician, but also a thinker, but he wasn't a liberal, he was a conservative. So he didn't make it in. So the principles that unite them are really maximizing freedom, the priority of individuals over groups, toleration, limiting coercion, the belief in the limited government, rule of law, spontaneous order, markets, the importance of civil society rather than top-down orders. All of these things are what unite these people, and they've all made contributions to that thinking.
You got some surprise in the book too. And for example, I mean, well, I think a few figures actually stand out. You add to the rank of liberals, for example, Ibn Khaldun. I think it's a very interesting choice. You're not the only one that did so in the past. I mean, many people stress, for example, that Khaldun is in some way proto-Smithian, but I'd like to have your view on that. And a very interesting and perhaps a bit odd choice for some would be Thomas Hobbes. I think most people generally think that Hobbes versus Locke is one of these great duel, really, in the history of political thought. So you have Hobbes and Locke, but for example, in the 20th century, instead, correct me if I'm wrong, you do not put among the liberals of the last century John Maynard Keynes. So can you elaborate, on these choices you made among, these 101 classical liberal thinkers?
Well, it's very difficult to compile a consistent list of people like this, because what you have to remember is that there are many people in history who were liberal on some subjects, but not liberal on others. And Keynes, I think, would be an obvious choice in that. So do those people make it, or do they not make it? Well, it's a matter of opinion. And some liberals have been very liberal on some subjects, but really very illiberal on a number of other things. So that's difficult. And I think obviously we want to make them so that they're people who are relevant to today, that they're saying something that we can, if you like, relate to. They're not talking about their own society in such deep terms that we can't really understand what they're talking about. So they've got to have some relevance. I mean, people like Ibn Khaldun, of course, was a 14th century, really, Islamic scholar. But the Islamic world was open up to liberal ideas long before they got to the West. Medieval Turkish emperors were more tolerant than many European leaders, for example. And Khaldun talks about property rights. He talks about incentives, that if you attack property, then you remove the incentive for people to work and improve themselves. That people think there's no point in owning property if they think a ruler or anybody else for that matter can just steal it from them. And that he believed that, he wrote that most people have only their labor and their skills to live off. And that if you didn't allow them to do that and to act freely and to do what they wanted, then they couldn't produce as much value doing what you would think they ought to be doing. So he was a very tolerant, but he also advised leaders of the time not to interfere too much. Now that seems to me to qualify him, even though there's many other parts of his thinking that we wouldn't regard as quite so liberal, but nevertheless, that seems to qualify him. Keynes, I must say that Keynes didn't even cross my mind. I can see that there are many people of that era who were certainly liberals, and another one would be Lord Beveridge, who developed the welfare state in Britain, and state healthcare and state housing and state education, but was essentially a liberal, even though he created this socialist enterprise. So he's somebody that I thought about. Keynes I didn't really, because I think that his economic policies have, if you like, been corrupted by his successors, and they've turned into sort of big government, big spending policies, and that's not really what he wrote about. But you know, that's really what people think of him today. So I didn't think he was appropriate to include. But it's pretty arbitrary. I'm sure I could add another 100, and I'm sure I could take 50 out. So take your choice.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing you do in the book quite clearly, but I do not think it's a concession to political correctness, is that you point out the contribution of some women, particularly in the 20th century. There are quite a few female thinkers in the 20th century, but also before. And in a sense, clearly, opening up political participation to women was a very big part of classical liberalism. Clearly, I mean, the name that comes to mind is John Stuart Mill, and having a rule of, one of the pillars of the rule of law is clearly equality in front of the law, in front of tribunals, equal political rights. So I would like to ask you if you could perhaps give us a flavor of the different female thinkers. I don't know if it's a proper PC parlance to call them this way, but of the women thinker that you added to the book, and perhaps present them briefly, because quite frankly, few of them, I shall confess, I never heard about myself. You know, I knew of Roswell Lane and Isabel Patterson, but for example, Suzanne La Follette is quite new to me as a name, and even before that, Josephine Butler, and I think is let me go back, Sarah Grimke, and you know, these are names, of course. Germain de Stael is very famous, very important classical liberal thinker. I mean, one of the things I never quite understood is why it is not better regarded among classical liberals. But still, you know, please, could elaborate on that before I got the bell ringing over me again.
Yes, I mean, I think women really appear on the scene really in the 18th century, and getting a lot of feedback from something with people like Mary Wollstonecraft, who was very much of a feminist, which in that age meant that you simply believed that women should have pretty much the same rights as men, because they didn't. They especially when you married, your property went into the control of your husband, and so on and so on. So she believed in equal rights and was a Republican, and she, you know, she didn't believe in an aristocratic society, but she believed in one which was elected, and so on. So that's an interesting one, I think. There are various women, American women, who played an important part in abolition of slavery. And the Grimke sisters, for example, who did come from a slave-owning family and taught slaves to read and write, which was a very dangerous thing to do at the time. So I think that they merited inclusion because they were really the pioneers of that movement. And then you've got, going back to John Stuart Mill, of course, you've got his wife Harriet Taylor, and there are many things that have gone under John Stuart Mill's name that were probably written by her, and she was very much in favor of female education, of female suffrage, giving women the vote. Again, a very radical idea in the early 19th century. And she looked at ideas like worker cooperatives. So I think she's an interesting one. More recently, of course, you've got the three famous American libertarians, Isabel Patterson, Rose Wilder Lane, and Ayn Rand. Patterson, of course, thought that creativity was being stifled by laws, and in particular women were being stifled by laws, and that regulations protect monopolies. Rose Lane talked about the creativity of free individuals and how the state had eroded individual freedom. And Ayn Rand, of course, invented a whole new philosophy and wrote novels and brought liberal thinking to huge numbers of people, especially young people who read her novels. So she's definitely worth including, it seems to me. And then lastly, of course, I've got Deirdre McCloskey, who's very much alive and well and with us, and has talked about the importance of how people value commerce and trade, and that it was that which led to the great flowering of the market economy in the sort of Elizabethan times, 15th, 16th century.
One challenging thing is, always somehow balancing between what people thought and their life. So how they experience freedom, particularly, I mean, in your view, what they did accomplish in the name of freedom, And just quite frankly, I mean, if we put ourselves, I mean, if I put myself in the shoes of a reader, you know, who was having a very interesting life? I mean, we know of many important classical liberal thinkers. I mean, one name obviously comes to mind, Adam Smith, who had a rather dull life. I mean, not a particularly eventful one. So thinking about not so much what they said, but the details of their lives. Who are the authors? Who are the names in this 101 that you think can better stuck with the reader's imagination?
I think one of the more interesting lives, I have to say, is that of John Lubin, who lived in the 17th century, and he was known as Freeborn John because he insisted that people were born with inherent rights. And this was not a time when people generally thought that, and certainly the authorities thought that people in England where he lived had absolutely no rights at all, and that the king decided, and the king's ministers decided how you should live. So he was known as a leveller. He didn't believe in financial equality, but political, moral, and legal equality. And he flouted the censorship rules of the time. At the time, if you wanted to publish something in England, you had to get the permission of what was called the Stationers' Company, which was really a way in which the government could censor books and papers and pamphlets. So unless you got their stamp on it, you couldn't publish it. But he went ahead and did it anyway, and complained about over large government and all the rest of it. And for that, he was brought to England's secret court, which was called the Star Chamber, where they never told you what you were charged of, and they never gave you any chance to call witnesses or anything like that. So he refused to bow to the judges on the grounds that they were doing their job and he was doing his. And he demanded to know the charges against him, and he refused to swear an oath that might make him incriminate himself. So for all of that, he was thrown into the stocks. He was whipped and pilloried. But even in the pillory, as he was there chained up outside in public, he still managed to give his pamphlets to the crowd. So he was a spirited sort of guy. And during the English Civil War, he joined the parliamentary side. But he argued against and complained about Cromwell, the parliamentary leader, because of the luxury that MPs were voting themselves and their religious intolerance and so on. So for that, he was imprisoned again. So he spent a huge amount of his life in prison simply for his beliefs. But you know, his name carries on because he really did put the ideas that we had inherent rights. He put that onto the agenda. Another one is Joseph Priestley, who was of course, he's known as a scientist. He was the discoverer of oxygen, but he was also a religious nonconformist. He didn't accept the Church of England or even the Catholic Church. And as such, he was officially barred from public office. But he was the one who really started to distinguish political rights, which are granted to citizens because they're a member of a particular political unit, from civil rights, which he thought were due to everybody, should be as wide as possible, that there was a private sphere that the government shouldn't interfere in. He believed in tolerance, obviously. So he was, I think, another interesting chap with an interesting life. But there are several of those. But Adam Smith, I have to say, is one of the most boring.
Yes, well, that's true. I mean, such a great thinker, but it would be very difficult to make a movie on Adam Smith's life. Let's put it this way. Let's face it. Similar, but now different question. in a sense, together with writing, the other great accomplishment of your life is the Adam Smith Institute. So an effort to spread ideas and strengthen the classical liberal movement. You're also the secretary of the Mont Pelerin Society, the great international organization of classical liberal scholars, established by Friedrich von Hayek in 1947. Some of the people in your list, I mean, some of the members of this school of thought, one great name that comes to mind immediately is Richard Cobden. They were thinkers, but they were also activists. They were consciously building a movement. As institution builders or as movement builders, who are the ones that you think accomplished the most?
Oh yes, yeah, well, you're absolutely right. Cobden and John Bright, of course, who were a good double act, one in Parliament and the other creating ideas. So one, if you like, was making the bullets and the other was firing them. But they were great activists because they started the Anti-Corn Law League, which was basically against tariffs on imported grain, foodstuffs. And that was tariff was, of course, very good for English producers, landowners, and big farmers in England, but it was very bad for the British public because they had to pay higher prices for their food. So they launched this campaign to get rid of those tariffs. And of course, you have to remember that at the time the railways were just coming in. So it was really the first, if you like, kind of national pressure group that you could go by train from this city to that city to this city, and you could speak to crowds there and then come back again and then do it again the next day. So you really did have you could build a national unit, a national movement, and Cobden and Bright definitely did that. And so I think they're to be credited. I mean, I think there are others like Rand, of course. Ayn Rand built a movement based on her objectivist philosophy, a philosophy of realism, but also of very robust laissez-faire. And she has admirers and enthusiasts around the planet. James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock, if you like, single-handedly, more or less, created the idea of public choice economics. I mean, yes, it did exist before them, but they really made it into a movement, if you like. And so now we don't just look at market failure, we look at government failure, and we look at how government works, and we look at the perverse incentives there are in government that lead us into economic disaster. So there's many of them, I think, that have created a movement, if you like, together with all of those who are just thinkers. But many of them have informed other movements. I mean, people like Bastiat, for example, is just in his little examples of liberal examples, like the broken window fallacy and so on. These have gone into the common language, and they are the fuel of think tankers. We refer back to all of these people and their insights as a shorthand way of explaining sometimes quite difficult, complicated subjects.
This brings us, now questions are coming in, and I will forward them to you in a little while. But, you know, this is clearly a very difficult moment for people who share a belief in liberty. You know, so to say, in 2007, 2008, we had a major crisis. The free market was blamed for that. The world has been recovering. I mean, Italy, not that much. Now we were hit by a totally different crisis, by a pandemic. But you know, the gist of the debate in many different countries, I suppose, including, I mean, it's fair to say, including England and Italy for sure, was somehow that, you know, liberalism is passé. Liberalism precisely in the sense of, you know, granting individual rights a primacy, you know, in front of whatever prerogatives the government think they do have. So the very beginning of the epidemic, government started to do more than ever before in terms of seizing people's liberty. And now everybody looks to government as, you know, promoting and fueling a recovery. So in your list, I'm sorry for this, in your list, who are the authors we should be looking at in this very difficult moment?
Well, you know, I think people talk about the current crisis, obviously, and we've actually seen a certain amount of pushback in the United States, for example. People were very reluctant to lock down and accept the government's authority that they had to stay in their homes, and they still resent that. So there is quite a strong liberal tendency still around, I think, and the same was true in the UK. But what I would say is I think that liberalism, if you like, is for normal times. It's not for emergencies. For emergencies, you do something different. And even Hayek talks about that in an emergency, other values come to the fore. So even he thought there should be state aid in times of emergencies. A liberal government, though, survives on the trust of its people. It only survives if it doesn't have to force people. So as long as people know that things like a lockdown is temporary, I think they're prepared to put up with it. In terms of recovery, yes, obviously we need much less intervention than we've had recently. We need more trade and open competition in order to promote new businesses, to fill the gaps that have opened up in our economies. And certainly, as far as we're concerned in the UK, you know, we think that Brexit will help that, because there's a big world out there, and we've always been a great free trading nation. So it's a temporary aberration, but I'm fairly confident that the liberal tendency will continue. This is not the end of capitalism as we know it, and I think that many of the people that I've reviewed in the book have got some very good ideas as to how to grow new businesses, how to develop competition, the importance of trade. All of these things, they all give us arguments which I think are extremely useful in fighting back from this temporary, I hope, aberration of increasing state control.
Well, I'm glad. I'm glad you're an optimist, and I suppose we ought to be, because pessimism is not particularly fruitful anyway. So, but in a sense, you know, I suppose the great value of this collection for anybody is that by reviewing these authors, you also review the extremely difficult situation in which they lived and in which they wrote. So, you know, Madame de Staël was living and writing under the French Revolution. And then she witnessed the rise of Napoleon. She needed to get out of France to move to Switzerland. Clearly, Hayek was writing The Road to Serfdom in Cambridge during the Second World War. So, in a sense, I'd like perhaps to try to stir you in this direction. Liberalism is not for the emergency, but if we think about the Second World War, for example, you got people like Hayek, The Road to Serfdom, Mises, omnipotent government, Popper, the Open Society, and his enemies. And during the war, these people were already writing and tried to envision a better, freer, more liberal post-war order. I think perhaps there's an argument the classical liberals should be doing that now too.
Yes, well, fair enough. I mean, many of the thinkers, if you look back at it, I mean, John Locke, for example, he didn't write even under his own name because his ideas were so controversial. He was exiled for a long time. And Hayek, as you've mentioned, but Voltaire, again, said some things that were very dangerous at the time to say, and spent some time in jail for doing so. So many of them, yes, and the American abolitionists, you know, many of them were seriously threatened with their lives. So all of these people have lived through some very turbulent times, and their great contribution, you are right, is that they have stuck to their principles, and they have explained why the times are as bad as they are, and they've suggested to us what we should be doing about it. So yes, we can all take inspiration from that, I think.
Now let me move to some questions that are coming from our audience. One is a question from Roberto Papa. So you heard that you exclude conservatives from proper liberal thinkers. So what about another great duel in history, Edmund Burke versus Thomas Paine? Was one of the two a liberal?
Well, I think I've got Paine in. I think I put Thomas Paine in as being a liberal. I don't regard Burke as a liberal. No, he was very much of a conservative. You know, his view was that, like Hayek to some extent, that there's a certain wisdom in traditions and customs, and indeed in laws. And I think liberals are more skeptical about that. So I don't really, I wouldn't class him as a liberal. But and also, of course, as I said, he was a politician, and his writings are mostly speeches rather than a sort of coherent school of thought. There are some things which are, you know, clearly very imaginative and instructive in his speeches, but he wasn't a sort of coherent thinker. He was a great thinker, but not really a coherent one. Paine, of course, I mean, I think that Paine is one of these people who certainly had a very deep understanding and feeling for individual rights. And, you know, he has to be credited because I think until his book Common Sense came out, the American revolutionaries really regarded themselves as English. They regarded themselves as Englishmen who were betrayed by an autocratic king and his ministers. And it was only, I think, after Paine had crystallized the ideas of, you know, no taxation without representation, and the importance of rights and how these rights were being denied by Britain. Only then did the Americans, I think, realize, yeah, we're not British at all, are we? We're American. I mean, and that is a sort of, it's a very powerful moment. So I think he probably gets in on that basis as much as anything.
Anyway, you know, you should assure us that you excluding Burke is not anti-Irish sentiment, isn't it?
I should point out that I'm quarter Irish and I have an Irish passport. So
okay, so that's fine. Now, we have a couple of similar questions. I mean, Paolo Mammola is asking if Thomas Aquinas was liberal or conservative. Which is a very tough question.
Yeah.
So I'm glad it is you who's supposed to be answering it and not me. And similarly, Gaetano Alessi is asking what are the major differences between a liberal and a conservative tradition or school of thought.
Well, on the Aquinas question and the scholastics, I think in general, I have included some of the latest scholastics because they did some important work on things like the limits of legitimacy of government and also on, of course, natural rights, which they thought came from God, but some natural rights theory goes right back to them, and you can lump Aquinas into that. I'd really see him as more of a conservative. He's never been one of my favorite people, I have to say, but yes, he's somebody that you might include for some of his ideas. Sorry, what was the second question? Remind me.
So what's the difference between liberalism and conservatism? I mean, what are the major differences between one and the other?
Yeah, that's a big question. You know, I'm sometimes not sure whether there is a major difference or whether it's really just a question of speed that conservatives think. I think probably quite rightly that you shouldn't rush forward with things. You should understand that the fabric of society has a certain wisdom. We've evolved in a certain way. Our institutions have evolved in a certain way, and they've evolved in those ways for a good reason. So if you want to change them, you have to go through a certain process, and you should take your time, and you should only change a bit of it at a time. Many liberals would subscribe to that, but they wouldn't necessarily think that you should be slow about it. They might think, yes, you should be careful, but there's an awful lot which does actually need to change. And just because something has been there for many hundreds of years, like our royal family, it doesn't mean to say that it's a good institution that you should keep. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but let's think about it. I would say that the main difference is that I think liberals are very skeptical indeed about collectives, that they believe that the individual is the heart of things, and that ideas and policy should be built around individuals, not around groups, whereas conservatives tend to be more groupish. That they tend to think that, no, there is a thing which is called society, there is a thing which is called nation, and different nations have different characteristics. I think liberals believe that much less, and liberals, I think, are often more tolerant. They're more tolerant to accept different ideas precisely because they're not so deeply wedded to existing institutions and religions and ways of doing things. So I think those are probably the main differences. But I would say, look, they're both on the same side in these things, but it's really just a different nuances of opinion.
In some sense, I think that the golden age of privatizations, I mean, in your lifetime, was associated with Thatcherism, and clearly, I mean, Mrs. Thatcher is an important symbol, both for classical liberals and for enemies of classical liberalism, of free markets, privatization, liberalization, and so on and so forth. If you think about the rhetoric and Thatcherism at large, can you distinguish a classical liberal and a conservative bent? How much of a classical liberal was she? How much of classical liberalism was really within the boundaries of Thatcherism?
Well, I've always believed that the idea of left-right, liberal, conservative, socialist, conservative, socialist, liberal doesn't actually work. That I think that there are these scales, but they're like that. It's more of a cross. and that there are some people who, in terms of economic policy, believe that you should be totally free market, totally liberal, and there's others that believe you should be totally state control. But the same is true in, if you like, individual and personal life. That again, some people think that the state has the right to control, or it should set your morality, and others, liberals, think no, your morality is something which is up to you. We can argue about it, but it's your choice, and your lifestyle is your choice. And if you want to take drugs, that's your choice, as long as it doesn't do harm to anybody else. Whereas a conservative would probably think, no, you must stop people from taking drugs. They're terrible, they're wicked, they're evil, and they do you damage, and we want to spare you from damage. A liberal would never say that. A liberal would never intervene in somebody's life for, quote, their own good, only if there was a danger to other people. So I think that is a more useful way of thinking about this liberal conservative thing. And in Mrs. Thatcher, yes, you had there an economic liberal. I mean, sure, she was constrained by her party and by the political realities and what she could do, but she believed in free markets. She believed in complete free markets and choice and competition and trade and all the rest of it. Which is one of the reasons why she had such bust-ups with the European Union on economic policy. But in terms of social policy, she did believe that people, that ordinary people were very good at running their own lives without politicians interfering. And yet there were kind of moral element, which there is in the Conservative Party in Britain, that thinks, well, yes, but there are some things that are just right, and we should make sure that people do things that are simply right. You can't question things like that. So there was a mixture in Mrs. Thatcher, but she came into office when we needed great economic liberalisation, and that's what she delivered. So that was a boon.
God bless her. We have a question about anarcho-capitalism, and MG is asking if you include in your list some libertarians like Murray Rothbard, and you do actually. I think the last thinker in your book is David Friedman.
Yes.
So Mr. 101 himself is David Friedman. He or she then asks, do you think that anarcho-capitalism has definitely lost the battle against classical liberalism? I'm not so sure what's the battle there, but I suppose this means, is anarcho-capitalism nowadays less attractive than it used to be to some people with classical liberal leanings, for example, in the 1990s?
Well, I would say to that, yeah, I mean, yes, I have got Murray Rothbard in. It's interesting just looking at the later editions, how many of them I actually knew. And I did rather vaguely know Murray Rothbard. I didn't like him very much, but nevertheless, I've included him because his development of the anarcho-capitalist theme is very important, and his work on private free currency issue is extremely important liberal idea. So yes, I think there is that, and there's David Friedman, who of course thinks that law should basically be a private enterprise. He thinks that most law is already organized by individuals who sign contracts and go to arbitration if one side breaks it, and the sort of state law is just the minority of things. So why don't we make the whole of the legal system private, and that we don't need the state for law and order? So that's again another amazing contribution. What I would say is that sometime around or after Mises, and of course Rothbard was a great follower of Mises, follower of Rand to some extent, but then they fell out, but then Ayn Rand fell out with everybody. But I think that, if you like, we went in we went into a railway siding, into the wrong direction. That there's a lot of good ideas from anarcho-capitalism, but they are very radical ideas, and it may be that maybe the world isn't quite ready for them yet. And so I think that by concentrating on those subjects, the anarcho-capitalists did, if you like, derail some of the mainstream thinking, and eclipse the mainstream thinking. So I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about it. My own belief is that I'd like to see lots of different flowers blooming, and then people can pick the one that they think is the best. And as long as people believe in freedom and free enterprise, then fine, they're on my side. But I do think that thinking in general, like the Austrian school of economics, really went into that dead end. And while who knows, they may be right in a sense, because they were just working out the logical implications of what Mises had started to do. But at the same time, young people in particular often weren't attracted by that. It was too doctrinaire, and it was too, if you like, sectarian, and a more general, open, liberal idea probably is more attractive to younger people. Not always, but as Rand shows, but I think in general, yes.
I think it's very difficult to assess, when it comes to idea, which is attractive to people. I suppose another interesting factor is, so to say, the government you're facing. I mean, in the Anglo-Saxon world, particularly in the 1980s, you got a sense that things may change in a classical liberal direction. If you think about countries like France or Italy, where you got a sense that it was so difficult and so expensive and possibly so hopeless, even to achieve small incremental reforms. I think this may be one of the reasons why some people were attracted to a more radical version of these ideas. I mean, we cannot think about entering politics and being useful. So we should think altogether outside of, so to say, the box of the modern state. This is just a conjecture on my part. No more than that.
Well, I think there's a great deal of truth in that, actually, because one of my other books, which I've finished but hasn't been published yet, is about democracy, and I've looked at democracy and how it works and its history, and try to explain it in very simple terms. And I'm very concerned about democracy. I think that we tend to elevate it as a god and think it's wonderful. And really, it is there for very limited purposes. We have democracy to decide things that we can't decide individually. Now, there are actually very few of those. But because we think democracy is so great, and of course it rose in our estimation after the expansion of the franchise to people without property and to women, so everybody can now vote. So it's this great inclusive thing, and we can all venture an opinion on important subjects. So we elevate democracy, and what that means is that politicians think, democracy is really great, so why don't we decide more things democratically? Let's have education decided democratically, and let's have healthcare and the size of your Coca-Cola can. Let's decide that democratically. And of course, what it means is that that's decided politically, and you get all of the public choice problems that Buchanan and Tullock and others told us about. because politicians in this process promote their own interests. So as democracy has expanded, it's really developed into populism, and that's what we have at the moment. So it's very difficult for liberals to come up with a liberal policy and say to an economic problem, for example, well, actually the best thing to do is nothing. Because people demand, oh, no, we want a democratic solution. You have to intervene and do something. So it is very difficult, I think, to make progress given the populism that we have at the moment. And I think that what we should be doing is to be saying as liberals, look, democracy is fantastic. It's a fantastic way of deciding things that we can't decide individually, because it does so without needing coercion and without having wars over things. We decide things through debate, but there's a very limited number of things that it's there to actually decide. So let people decide their own lives, and politics will decide the things that we can't decide in any other way.
We have a question about Baruch Spinoza. So what about Spinoza? He wrote things that seem to me very close to liberalism. Would you consider him a liberal? So would you?
Yes, I don't think that I actually included him, partly because, yes, you know, you certainly can argue that he has many liberal ideas, but I think that they're sort of smothered in the rest of his writings. So I don't claim to be an expert on Spinoza. There was a time when I did know a lot more about it, but I think I've forgotten most of it. But I wouldn't think that he, if you like, stands out in the pantheon of liberal thinkers. He's contributed some liberal ideas, but he didn't make my cut. But then a lot of good people didn't make my cut.
Here's another question that actually brings us back to Ibn Khaldun, but also to others. So you asked if you did find any kind of liberal thinkers in pre-modern, non-Western societies or traditions, so China, India, Islam. I think this is a very challenging question, because in many ways we tend to see naturally, I mean, you're British, though a quarter Irish, I'm Italian, so we tend to see classical liberalism in the context of what we may call the Western tradition. But clearly the idea of liberty has the aspiration to be universal, to be talking to anybody in the world. I would just like to mention that one of your predecessors as secretary of the Montpellier Society, Bruno Leoni, which is of course the patron saint of our institute, his last published essay that actually came out of a Montpellier Society meeting in Japan was about non-Western ideas of liberties, and something that Leoni claims there, and which is controversial, and unfortunately Leoni was killed really soon after he wrote that piece, so he could not build on that. But one of the things that Leoni claimed there is that you can find in the Oriental, in the Japanese and Chinese tradition, some elements that really resemble the Roman Christian liberal understanding of liberty. So I think this is a very, very complex question. Once again, I'm very happy it is you who should answer.
No, that's an easy one. Because I mean, Amartya Sen, the Nobel economist, wrote exactly the same thing, that there is a great deal of liberal thinking outside the Western tradition, that we shouldn't think that liberalism is an entirely Western invention. And indeed, if you want it to prosper around the planet, that's very wise advice. You know, don't think of it as being in particular a European thing, which is where much of the modern thinking came from, but these ideas, you can find them all over the place. And certainly in ancient China, I mean, my first guy was in ancient China, 600 BC. We don't even know exactly when he was born and when he died. Lao Tzu. And you've got, well, I suppose it's European, but you've got Pericles in Athens. You've got other Chinese talking about the limits to, I don't know how you pronounce it, but Zhuangzi, who lived about 300 BC, he talked about the limits to the knowledge of legislators, that legislators didn't know everything. And therefore, if they didn't know everything, how could they interfere in people's lives? Because they would make mistakes, right? Now, that's a very important liberal idea, but it comes out of China 2 and a bit thousand years ago. And you've got in India and in the Islamic world, yes, there are lots of people talking about religious tolerance. Akbar the First talks about the importance of religious tolerance. Of course, he had to deal with lots of different competing religious groups who were at each other's throats, and he thought the best way to deal with it was to urge them to get on together and to look at their what unites them as opposed to what divides them. So that's another liberal thinking. But yes, I think but since the sort of 18th century, certainly, I think most of the liberal thinking has actually been European or American. And I think that's a misfortune. It may be, I feel that with continents such as Africa opening up, okay, there's a very strong British tradition in Africa with the empire and the Commonwealth and so on. But nevertheless, I'm uplifted by the number of young people who are absorbed by liberal ideas and are taking them in new directions for their own societies. So I think that we'll see liberal thinking coming out of directions like that more and more as time goes on.
Well, that's indeed an uplifting thought. Now we've basically been chatting for an hour, and we have our policy to keep within these time limits. But let me ask you, let's picture that you meet a magician, and this magician can make you a trick and allow you to speak for 1 hour. With one single woman or man who belongs to this school of thought and is no longer with us. So she or he doesn't attend meetings of the Mont Pelerin Society and neither can answer phone calls. So who will be the one you want to spend an hour with?
Golly, there's such a choice. Well, I'm not sure I would say Adam Smith. I think he would be too quiet. I think, did I include David Hume? Let me check. Yeah, David Hume, I think, would be the most interesting man. But I think everybody says that. So I think probably, you could easily spend an hour with Deirdre McLaughlin. Oh, she's still with us. You could easily spend an hour with Hayek or Friedman. I think, Friedman would be just an uplifting person to spend an hour talking to. And he was, because I've done it.
Well, that's pretty good. Now, before ending our conversation, let me ask you a bizarre question, but these are the times. We read in the last few days that among the statutes that were at risk of being removed in England was a statue by William Gladstone, a great classical liberal politician. I think a very bizarre choice for removing somebody because it was, after all, people's William. So his father may have owned slaves, but clearly Gladstone was anti-slavery who's an apostle of tolerance, of modern democracy, who's really the champion of inclusive liberalism, if you want to call him it this way. If I'm right, there is a statue of Adam Smith in Edinburgh. Is that safe?
Well, I certainly hope so, because I raised the money to put it up. But I certainly hope so, because Adam Smith, of course, believed that slavery was not simply vile, he called it vile, morally, but it was also a very fairly useless economic system, that in order to get work from a slave, he said, since the slave has no possibility of improving themselves through hard work, the only way to get work out of people would be to beat them, and which was another evil, of course. So Adam Smith was very much against slavery, and I think some of the abolitionists did take a cue from him. So I don't think that that he's in particular danger. But as you say, if activists can target people like William Gladstone, then who knows? The issue is that we can't really judge people by our standards. Their times were different, and what seemed entirely natural to them, like owning slaves in many cases in the before the 18th century. It seemed entirely natural to them. To us, it seemed utterly repugnant. So if it was natural to them and nobody thought it was wrong, or few people thought it was wrong, can you really judge them? And I think, well, we have to judge these things according to how they make us feel today. And if they do cause resentment and anger, then perhaps some symbols should be removed. But you can't judge people in the past, and I think that it was. I think that if you're going to make these sorts of decisions, it's much better that it's done by a rational discussion between individuals rather than by the heated actions of a mob.
Well, absolutely. Also, you may want to auction some statues. I do have a terrace, not a very big one, but I would be very pleased to also statue of William Gladstone on my terrace. That I can tell you. Well, Eamonn, it has been an absolute pleasure. Is there any thing you want to say to your Italian readers, perhaps? And of course, what I want to tell them is that, as Enzo may show us in a minute, 101 classical liberal thinkers, 101 grandi pensatori liberali, una tradizione a difesa della libertà è disponibile per l'Istituto Bruno Leoni, sia in libro di carta sia in e-book. So your book is available in Italian. It's 12 euros, very well spent, or 5 euros, $4.99 as an ebook. So is there something you want to say to your readers or to your future readers?
Well, obviously I wanted to say buy the book and read the book, but I also want to say that I think that there is an enormous amount of good ideas in this little book. They're not my ideas, but they're ideas of great minds over the last 2.5 centuries. And whenever you think that things are really dark and really bad and that liberal ideas can't possibly win, read the book and remind yourself of all of those people who championed liberal ideas through very difficult times and succeeded, and remember them and let them inspire you.
Well, and on this note of optimism, let me thank you again. Thank you so much to Eamonn Butler for this conversation and for his work, really. And I do hope it may be an inspiration to many of us in these difficult times. Difficult, but in a sense, we've certainly seen wars for liberty and humankind. Thank you so much, Eamonn.
Thank you.